Oyez, oyez, oyez. Anyone having business before the King's Justice of the Superior Court of Justice, attend now and you shall be heard. The Honorable Madam Justice Hennessy presiding. Long live the King. You may be seated. Unless done in accordance with the Superior Court of Justice protocol on the use of electronic devices, these proceedings are not to be recorded. Thank you.
Good morning, all. Just before we start, I'll let you know that I would like the break to be either before or by 11:35, so I can take a call just for 10 minutes. Okay. Thank you. All right. Good morning, sir. All right.
First, just in order of business, over the weekend, my friends have had an opportunity to look at Exhibit E as a handbook for identification and have agreed to could be marked as the next exhibit, number exhibit.
So exhibit, oh, the
monster.
slide deck. Okay. Just got Leslie. Oh, you've got one. Yeah, just tell me to start. I forgot mine, so but I've got something to work with.
So that's been entered by consent.
Yes, thank you. And it will be called the slide.
Trial demonstratives of Professor Joseph Stiglitz. And if I can continue.
Please go ahead.
So, good morning. I wanted to just go back for a moment before we turn to deal with, first of all, throughout this trial, the judge has heard already, he's going to hear about a long-term bond rate of 5% and trust account rate of 5.3% and a 7.2% for the investment. Okay. It's my understanding that those are what's called nominal, are nominal rates of return, not real rates of return.
That's right.
Can you explain the difference between nominal rates of return and real rates of return, and what the 5%, the 5.3%, 7.2% adjusted for real rate of return?
Yeah, the only difference between nominal and real is inflation, and they just adjust for the fact that you can buy less today with $1 than you could have 10 years ago or 170 years ago. So a dollar today, whether a Canadian dollar or a US dollar, it doesn't mean the same as it did 170 years ago. So real just means it's done, it's that adjustment. And the way you do that is with some kind of price index that reflects the increase in the cost in dollars of purchasing a particular basket of goods. And there are challenges in measuring that. So there's a certain, lack of precision, but not a lot. I mean, there's a widespread agreement. But when you're going back 170 years, those problems become greater. So if we were doing these kinds of calculations today, I would have, said, let's focus on the real, because that's what really matters. But we do the nominal because we don't have reliable price indices going back 170 years. And your last part of your question was, what difference does it make? Well, inflation has been in the order of magnitude of 2 to 3, 2.2%, you know. So what it means is you want to deduct from that number, the nominal number, a number corresponding to the rate of inflation. So that's a number 2.2, 2.5, 3%, depending on your estimate of inflation. So if you are talking about a 5% interest rate, bond interest rate, that's a nominal. To bring it back to real, we're talking about a 2 to 3% real interest rate, which is not, you know, a very large number.
And the 5.3 would be reduced by the 2 to 3% inflation, and the 7.2% would be reduced by the 2 to 3% inflation.
Exactly.
And throughout the analysis you did from 1850 to 2019, just to be clear, was there a kind of an average interest inflation rate that was?
Yeah, that's what I
seen?
mentioned. It was in the range of 2 to 3 to can't remember exactly right now the best number, but you know, numbers in that range are the appropriate numbers.
Second thing I wanted to do by way of was to go back to slide 44. In slide 44, we were discussing relative wealth on Friday, and we were discussing the orange line and the green line, and we were discussing the differences between Ontarians generally and Aboriginal within RST. And as I thought about what you had said, I'm wondering if perhaps there might have been a misunderstanding, maybe on my part, and I just wanted to clarify some things. The orange line deals with Aboriginal people within RST.
That's right. And it's a measure, as it says, income per capita. It's a surrogate for wealth. It's a surrogate for the levels of deprivation. It's just as I say, we use the term proxy because there are lots of different metrics you can use, but they all have the same pattern.
But the population you looked at was people within RST for the Aboriginal number.
That's right.
Did you do the same thing for the green line? Or is it different?
No, the green line, we had to use the data that we had was for Ontario as a whole. And in some period where we had the data for the RST specifically, it tracked very closely that green Ontario. But in general, remember what I said in the beginning, in general, you don't have all the data that you want. And so we thought it was more important to have a consistent time series. And the only consistent time series that we had was for Ontario.
And the other thing that I think I may have asked or misunderstood, the all Ontarians figure actually includes in Aboriginals as well.
That's right. So if you were going to do, just to make it clear, if you're going to do a chart of the non-Aboriginal, it would be even steeper because you would subtract out the low income of the of the First Nations.
But would it be much lower given the population?
No.
Can I go back to one
Mhm.
thing? Sir, your you said I would go to the real interest rate, but we don't have reliable indices. Is that what you're saying is I would usually go to the real interest?
Real is a way of, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I think you've got that you would usually refer to or want to use for your calculations real interest rates, but because you don't have reliable indices, you have just used the nominal rate.
That's right. Let me put it differently. I like to think in real terms because our yardstick is changing all the time because of inflation. And so, if you're thinking, $2,000 in 1850 isn't the same as $2,000 today. And so when you hear the number 2,000, you shouldn't think about $2,000 as it is today. So I think it's helpful for people always to think about what it would have meant in goods today, in real terms today. That it's just, it doesn't matter which way you do it. Technically, you can do it either way, but in thinking about things, I like to do everything in terms of what it would mean in terms of the way we understand a dollar today, because it's very much ingrained in our thinking. It's hard for us to keep saying $2,000 in 1850 means more than today and precisely more, but we can't quite do that in a systematic way, and it's also very difficult to translate all the data all the time. So we use the nominal data because that's the way people record things in their books.
Thank you.
But I just want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding about this point. If the question that one is asked is, what is the loss of opportunity? You still have to factor in inflation, don't you?
Yes, I mean, that is to say, when you should have been paid a certain amount, what we would talk about is the amount that you would receive today, and adjusting that is the nominal interest rate.
But if you use real rates of return, how does inflation factor into the calculation of what the lost opportunity was?
Oh, you either would need to increase the value of what was lost by converting everything into real terms and then using the real rate, or looking at it at the nominal price and using the nominal rate.
Right.
So the way we do it is we do it everything nominal and use the nominal rate. And that's, a consistent way of doing it. Is that clear? I hope so.
It's clear to me, but more importantly, I'm hoping it's clear for the court.
As clear as it can be.
Okay.
I've got it.
So I wonder if we could turn to the part of the slide deck that's called key rebuttal issues over at page 65 of the slide deck of 65. And what we're going to take you through here is this part of your presentation and your evidence involves, I guess what we would call it, the really excerpts of part of the reply report. And the first thing is there is a summary at slide 65 of a couple areas of disagreement that you want to talk about, right?
That's right.
Perhaps you can introduce them.
Well, the point here is that, there are a lot of complexities in this case, and not a surprise, given that we're talking about 170 years of data. We talked about the many aspects of natural resources, of the values of the land. And in some ways, I think there are surprisingly few areas of disagreement, and particularly surprisingly few areas of big disagreements. There's going to be a lot of particular small points, but there are roughly 4 areas that account for much of the dollar value. And those are the appropriate treatment of risk and its implications for sharing. I talked a little bit about that in the discussion of opportunity costs, but we'll hopefully come back to that. The second is something we spend a lot of time on, the relevance of economic rents, where I've argued economic rents provides the best basis for thinking about what the Anishinaabe brought to the table. And therefore, in some sense, it was the basis of whatever theory of sharing that you're going to have. It's what they brought to the table. What we just discussed at the end of Friday was how do you appropriately account for the time value of money for somebody, for a First Nation that is long-lived as opposed to an ordinary individual. And that was a key distinction there. And again, probably come back to that. And then a final thing is a problem of allocating expenses to the direct Crown resource revenues, because the direct Crown resource revenues are what they allege ought to be the only thing to be shared. We talked about there being other kinds of resource revenues, indirect, that were recaptured when the Crown didn't capture it directly. And part of the problem here, we'll see, is that they allocate expenses to the direct Crown resource revenues when those expenses were really associated with all of rents, which are much bigger. Remember, the direct Crown resource revenues were a small fraction.
You say they allocate expenses to direct revenues, which are,
No, they're a bundle of expenses.
yes,
And then the question is, how do you attribute those?
attribute.
And they attribute them, in some cases, disproportionately to the net Crown resource rev, where actually those expenses should be allocated to rents more generally, or to other public purposes that the Crown might have wanted to pursue, but not incrementally, at least, associated with net Crown resource revenues. So when you make that kind of excessive attribution of expenses, you're going to get net Crown revenues to be much smaller. So there are a number of areas of that. A lot of those Mr. Hutchings is going to talk about because they're more detailed, but I'll talk about some of the broad frameworks.
So Professor,
Mr. Schechter,
Yeah.
will you be asking, not necessarily now, that kind of summary question on what areas this witness or any other witness says are in agreement? These are the areas of disagreement. And Professor Stiglitz said there are surprisingly few areas of disagreement and
okay.
even fewer of
Yeah.
that affect the numbers, but I'll leave that with you.
Oh, that's a good, fair question. I was not going to do that because it's in their reports what they agree upon, but if you would like, I'm sure Professor Stiglitz might, probably Mr. Hutchings is better able, because he crunched the number, did more of the crunching of the numbers. We can make sure that he does that and explains those areas of agreement. I think perhaps it's better left for Mr. Hutchings.
Okay, and I'll leave it.
Yeah, thank you for the advance.
Yeah.
Notice, Professor
Can I
Stiglitz, did
just
you
say-
want to weigh in on
Yeah,
that?
even in the areas where, what I said, basic agreement, there can be quibbles.
Right.
And so I was looking at from the broad, big numbers. And even when there are broad agreement, there can be disagreement on one particular line item, whether it should, in this question of attribution, Should it be attributed to NCR, to crown, direct crown rents, or should it be attributed more broadly? So there'll be a lot to keep you entertained. But
Or keep my attention.
okay, keep your attention. But a lot of those are not big picture items.
Okay.
So Professor Stiglitz, I mean, I'm just holding up your opening report and your reply report. There are a lot of words and paragraphs in there and data and discussion. We're not, you stand by what's in your reports, yes?
Yes,
We're not taking you through every single issue. We're just trying to highlight what you've identified as some of the key issues in disagreement.
that's right. We want to be out of here pretty soon.
Okay, so let's go to slide 66, which you've identified as a smell test, and it's in response to what Professors Bodway and Smart have done. And it's part of your reply report, yes?
Yes,
And as I understand it, this issue that you're about to talk about has to do with risk. Is that right?
that's right. And at the way they deal with risk, and one of the ways, that something that might seem mechanically doing the right thing, at the end you want to say it doesn't make sense. And I call it smell test. That does you look at the results of a particular piece of analysis, and then you say, does that result make sense? And if it doesn't, then you go back and try to figure out where was the mistake, and that's what we're going to do here.
Okay, so maybe you can continue.
So the example is, suppose a new mineral deposit was discovered just before this trial in the RST. And the reason why I want to do it right before, I don't want to get into the question of the time value of money that we just talked about. So we don't have any problem of figuring out what the opportunity cost of bringing the money up from 2020 to 2022. That's not a significant number. Okay, so I try to isolate one problem, one issue. So suppose everyone agreed that this deposit is worth 100 million in net crown resource revenues. There's no uncertainty, and everybody agrees it just came out of nowhere. So we don't have to deduct anything. With no disagreement about what were the expenses of doing it. It was just like almost manna from heaven. Okay, just came here and we got 100 million NCRRs. And let's go through how that 100 million would be shared between the Anishinaabe and the Crown using their methodology, the Bodway and Smart methodology. The point is, when you do the calculations, what you see is the Crown would get 99% of the NCRs, and the RST, the Anishinaabe, would get 1 million. And actually, when you look at even in more detail, because the way they have positive NCRs offset by negatives that have accumulated, they would say, they get 0. That just offsets some of the losses that have previously occurred. And it's actually even worse if we do a thought experiment of what would happen if that same $100 million were discovered in 2050, then putting aside this loss provision, they would have gotten 500,000. So they get 0.5%. And, to me, what I say is this test, it doesn't pass what is a reasonable, consistent way of sharing for a long-term agreement that I understand was the intent of the agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Crown. Basically, what it says is the value of the resources, the share that the Anishinaabe gets goes to zero.
So that brings us to the next slide, I think. And
That's right.
the judge has seen this slide through my opening, but it really takes some explanation from an expert to explain why this curve is as it is.
Well, what they do is to take a dollar earned in each of those years and take it back to 1850.
Say that again, please.
So take the example, they got $1 in 2020. They say, what is the value of $1 in 2020 back in 1850? Okay, so they're trying to estimate how much would I have had to been willing to pay for $1 in 1850 to get $1 today in 2020. And they say, I'm not willing to pay very much for $1 in 2020, in 1850 for $1 in 2020. And why are they willing to pay so little? Is they say there's just too much risk for it. And so they discount the value of the dollar in 2020 at a very high rate. And that means effectively nothing is worth anything going forward. And that's why basically they say the Anishinaabe shouldn't get anything for any of the resources from now on. I'm exaggerating, 1%, 0.5% gets lower and lower. So it is effectively their interpretation of the agreement is the way they implement it is not a sharing agreement. It's a phase out of the Anishinaabeg's share going forward.
And you're they, this is
This is
a response
Boudreaux and
to
Smart.
Boudreaux and Smart. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And I
So-
think you try and explain it further on slide, probably slide 69, or unless you want to mention.
No, that's exactly. So just what I say here is their approach
Slide 69?
is entails two steps.
Oh, okay.
They
Great.
take the returns received in any year back to 1850 using a risky rate. Okay, so that means that $20 in 1850 isn't worth very much.
Why do you say a risky rate? What does that mean?
They use a high rate representing the kinds of numbers we talked before, including a risk premium. Okay, so it's the kind of, I can't remember now what the exact number was, but a number, not the bond rate, but a number much higher than that to reflect a risk premium. Okay. Now, let's be clear. Both the Anishinaabe and the Crown, who are the two parties to this agreement, are long-term investors. Remember, I talked about long-term investors have a different attitude towards risk than ordinary individuals have to worry about all those things I talked about, business cycles, divorce, unemployment, all those issues, which are retirement, all those things of an ordinary individual. A long-term entity looks at this from a long-term perspective. And so their view of risk is totally different. And so they make the mistake of using the risk premium of an ordinary individual for Canada or for the Crown
Yeah,
or for Donna Shabak. And it's wrong on both accounts.
So they use the risk premium of a consumer, an individual consumer
That's right.
versus.
Well, we would say
a
the
crown.
market, you know, reflected in the stock market, in the market, okay? So that means when you use that high number, the value in 1850 of something in 2020 is going to be very small. And then the second approach part of this is they take that $1850
the one that's been discounted.
discounted
Yeah,
and they bring it up back to 2020. And there they use a very low rate.
can you explain why they would do that?
It doesn't make any sense to me, but so I can't, but they say that's the appropriate way of, that's the appropriate opportunity cost. So when you use a large number to bring things back to 1850, and then a small number to bring it from 1850 back to where it was in 2020, you're going to get a low number. So you make it a very small number going back, and you then don't increase it in a corresponding way going forward back to 2020 when the dollar originated. And so that's why they wind up with 1% for a 2020 dollar. And so, you know, as I say, what I've argued is because both for Crown and Canada, these are well, they're actually 2 points. We'll come to the both for Crown and Canada. These are long-term investors. You shouldn't bring it.
Both for the Anishinaabe in Canada?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Shabak in Canada. Thank you. These are long-term investors. Bringing it back to 1850 at the discount at that was at that risky rate didn't make any sense.
Can we go, can we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
But you've identified a fundamental conceptual flaw in their
Yeah.
analysis.
More
It
important
needs
than
to
the-
be explained.
Yeah. So more important than the one I just said, which is the risk factor, which was wrong. If you were going to do it, you shouldn't do it at all, because the treaty took a wait and see approach to determining payments. It wasn't there was no need or basis for going back to 1850 to value the payments. It was payments were made when the revenues occurred. Both parties shared the risk. The context in which something like what they did might have been relevant would be if there was a purchase of the land by a private party, not by the government, but
A one-time purchase.
a one-time purchase. Then you would say, from a private party, very risk averse. I'm trying to evaluate a risky asset that I'm going to buy. Then how much am I willing to pay? And you would worry about that, and you would take that into account. Okay. But that's not what happened here. They didn't, there wasn't a purchase. They didn't get the money up front. And part of the reason why that they didn't do that is both sides knew that they didn't know. They didn't know what was the resources. There were differences of views about what those resources were, but what I call the wait and see approach means you don't have to figure out what there is. You say, we'll wait and see, and when it occurs, we'll share the proceeds. And, according to kinds of principles that I talked about on Friday. So in that approach, there's none of this discounting back to 1850 and then from 1850 back to 2020. In 2020, they discovered that mine. That mine gave them $100 million. And the appropriate thing is sort of the obvious thing. I mean, the simple thing. It's sort of, sometimes economists get themselves wrapped up in their own methodologies, but there's a very simple thing. You discover $100 million in 2020. The natural thing that ordinary people would say, you share the $100 million. It's not 1 million, it's 100 million.
To share, 100 million to share.
To share, and Bodway and Smart say, no, it's only 1 million to share. You scratch your head and say, what happened to the other 99 million? It's there. And so you share that 100 million. That's what you share. And that mistake appears over and over and over again. So all the returns are, in every year when they occur, Bodway and Smart bring it back to 1850. So the point is, their approach, Bodway and Smart's approach, is just inconsistent with the facts of the case on how risk was born, and with what my understanding of the whole framework of the treaty was that it was supposed to be a sustained relationship. It wasn't a buyout, and it wasn't one where where you're basically saying you're out, you're out of the game to the Anishinaabe. They were supposed to be a sustained part of the relationship. So what you see from that graph that you had 2 slides before
Did
was
you want to
that,
go back there, or?
well, is that sharing effectively disappears. Any new resources that are discovered in the future, the value of those resources go basically to the crown. Over 99% of it go to the crown.
Do you say that the graph shows the application of the Bodway and Smart work, or just that it's the non-sharing, the non-implementation of the treaty? And maybe I don't need to ask you that.
Well,
I'm just
it
saying.
is the implication of their interpretation of the treaty. In other words, they have
So
a
had the
method.
treaty been shared, had there been attention to the sharing, and the Bodway and Smart approach was applied, it would have resulted in a graph much the same.
Yeah,
As
even
when
if-
there was no attention paid to the implementation of the treaty.
Exactly. So going forward, let's say in their methodology going forward, so they abide by the treaty. Okay. This is the implication of the methodology. They haven't actually addressed this, but let's say the implication of their methodology is that in 2025, another mine like this is discovered. The implication of their methodology is we have to, in 2025, value the resource as if it were in 1850, and then share the risk-adjusted net crown revenue, resource revenue, calculated in that way, brought up to 2025. Because they are treating it as if it's a buyout. I mean, there's no as far as I can understand, there's no discontinuity between 2020 and this, when they hadn't honored their agreement, and 2025, where they're now asserting that they will honor the agreement.
And I just want to stay with this chart for this figure, the graph for a moment. And so in 1850, it starts off at 100% and goes down to 1% in 2019. You see that?
Yes,
And so if you were sitting on the ground in 1850 and if this is the implications of their work, when we get to 1877, it's as though there was an agreement that said, here's the deal. We'll give you 100% of the net revenues in 1850. We'll give you 50% of it in 1877. By 1911, it's down to 20%. And then after that, it'll continue to go down until by 2019, it's less than 1%. That's what this graph is telling us.
that's right.
Now, I want to compare that for a moment. I want to go back to slide 44 because the big sharing is in the first number of years. And you took us and explained at slide 44, the gray area. And it's almost inverse, where the wealth actually materializes. Is that?
That's right. Remember the gray area in that is the net crown resource revenues. And so they're very little in the earlier period, but then they go up a lot after beginning around World War I. So if you put those two graphs together, what you say is, and they're, Broadway and Smart have this model that they call rational expectations, where you rationally anticipated where everything was going to go. They're saying that the Anishinaabe would have agreed to an agreement where they say, we'll take a big share, 100 to 50%, in the period when there are no revenues.
Yes.
And we'll accept a very low fraction in the period when there are high revenues, up to the point where it's actually 1%. To me, that is not conceivable as what rational parties would have agreed to.
So I think we should go back to the slide we were on. I think it was about 70 or 71.
72.
71. Did you finish with 71 or
No, 71, I mean. Yeah.
71? Yeah, all right.
So the one way of thinking about, where did they go so wrong is, it's partly they misconstructed what the relationship was. They misconstructed the nature of what was the risk transferred. So what I've done in this and the next chart is to try to summarize what was the risk borne by each of the two parties. And
By chart, you mean slide.
the Anishinaabe and the Crown. But
By chart, you mean the slides.
yeah,
Yeah.
the slides, I'm sorry. So the important point is this guaranteed minimum does not remove the risk altogether. In fact, one of the things that we've talked about is that they were almost sure to get that minimum anyway. That there was not much benefit out of that. I'll come back to that in a second.
Just before you go on, and the guaranteed minimum we're talking about is what?
At $2,000.
Okay.
Dollars, because it was very clear that the resource, it was pretty clear. I don't want to say it was pretty clear that the resources would generate $2,000, but they took the risk that the payments would not increase beyond that amount. In other words, that wealth would not actually materialize from the lands and resources. They took all of that risk. They also took another set of risks.
Sorry, this is the Anishinaabe.
The Anishinaabe, yeah, I'm trying to describe here the risk of the Anishinaabe.
They took the risk that even though it looked like a good risk, they took the risk that it wouldn't generate 2,000.
That's right.
Okay.
They bore all the risk of what would happen beyond the minimum 2,000. They bore that risk. And they also bore a special set of risk in, you might say, in dealing with the crown. They took the risk that the crown might not manage the resources as well. And if they didn't have a choice of normally in a normal market, if somebody doesn't manage your resources, well, you fire them and you get somebody that does a better job. If you had a manager that had losses year after year after year, may say for 100 years, in one of your lines of businesses, like managing your forest, you might say, maybe they're not doing a good job managing my forest. My forests are not worthless. So you might get another manager, but they didn't have a choice of firing the crown if it didn't do a good job. So they were stuck. So they had that problem. Whether that mismanagement was because they just were incompetent, or whether that mismanagement was because they had a broader set of objectives, they had a broader set of obligations to all the citizens of Canada, it didn't matter. They bore the risk that it would not be managed in their interest.
The Anishinaabe board.
In the Anishinaabe, yeah. And there was a risk that they might manage the resources well, but they might manipulate the accounts. Or manipulate may not be the right word, but they might use, remember we talked about the hydroelectric and how they could charge the rents or not charge the rents. So they might use a way of doing it that might not generate for the Anishinaabe the full value of the resources that they were due, even if they manage the resources well. And finally, there was a risk that the treaty partner would not fulfill the obligations. And if you look back at the history at that moment, that was a risk that seemed to be felt very strongly. On the other hand, let's look at the risk borne by the crown. And the only risk that they had was that if the value of the resources proved to be lower, much lower than expected, when much lower than expected, the expectation, that they were paying to other people, to other First Nations, was $10 per capita. It was much higher than what they offered to the 160 per capita. So only if it was, like less than 16% of what was expected, were they on the hook. So they bore very little risk, and
They being the crown.
the crown bore very little risk. And what we mentioned earlier in the discussion of the joint venture sharing agreement that we talked about on Monday, what we mentioned is that the NCRRs in the first 25 years was sufficient to fund $6,000 per year in perpetuity. So in one way of looking at it, by 1875, that $2,000 was totally taken off, risk disappeared.
And that's even though the gray area on slide 44 doesn't show much.
That's right. So here is a second smell test. So the first smell test was, it just doesn't make any sense. Their methodology just phases out the Anishabak as a sharing, and it could not be a reasonable understanding of the parties. That was the first.
Maybe I can ask the question this way. What does Bodway and Smart's approach say about the wait and see approach? Is theirs a wait and see approach?
No, it's not. It was approach that makes sense only if it were a one-time purchase, which it was not. And even then, it doesn't make any sense because it treats the risk of Canada, the risk profile of Canada, the risk willingness. It treats the Crown as if it were an ordinary individual, and that's wrong. So it's wrong on several accounts. Now, this is the second smell test. And that's really what we talked about on Friday in connection with the hydroelectric and the tax expenditures. They rely on direct NCRs alone, and they say rents aren't of relevance. What the Anishabak brought to the table is of no relevance. And I just, when I say smells test, it doesn't make any sense. They don't articulate any limitation in the Crown's discretion to set direct resource revenues or expenditures. And they don't discuss how these decisions should affect sharing. So in their model, if the Crown chose to collect zero direct resource revenues, regardless of the rents generated by resources, regardless of the value of the resources that the Anishabak brought to the table, under their methodology, the Anishabak should and would never receive anything beyond the $2,000 per year. And that just seems wrong to me. Their view of sharing is unrelated to the value of the Anishabak's contribution. And I just as an economist, it just seems not what would be the intention of the parties. And it doesn't seem like the kind of agreement that two parties would have agreed to.
Right. And you want to go to yet a third kind of smell test?
Well, that has to do with some of the numbers that specific numbers that Bodway and Smart come up with. They claim that the present value of NCRRs for the RST territory is a loss of $7.9 billion.
And that's over what period?
Over the whole period.
Okay. The whole period being 1850 to 2019.
That's right. And just think about it. If their numbers and methodology were correct and reasonable, it would have meant that by the 1960s, the Crown would have been willing to pay a lot to get rid of the lands. In other words, if they really took their numbers seriously, the Crown would have been willing, sometime in the 1960s to go back to the Anishabak and say, please take the land back from us. And we'll give you a lot of money to take back the land. It's just a burden on us. All this RST, all the forest, all the minerals, all that 100 million hypothetical mine I discovered, take it all back. It's just not worth it. We're just getting losses out of this.
But you also said not only just take the land back, but we'll pay you to.
We'll pay you to take it back. Yeah.
How does you need to explain that for me? Why?
Well, because
pay?
They claim that the Crown is running a huge loss on this. Think about this as like a business. You took on the responsibility for the RSD. It's a business. You hoped it would generate some rents. And then around 1960, you discover this big thing that you undertook, this big project is going to generate nothing but losses from now until you can see into the future. And I'll give you a little bit of what that means.
Okay.
But what I mean, and so seeing all the losses, what would a reasonable person do? A reasonable actor, it's not a person, a reasonable actor do, would
Yes.
say, rather than having these losses, take the land back. We'll save ourselves a lot of money by paying you to take the land back. Now that doesn't comport to, that's why I call it a smell test. Was the Crown so irrational that it had all these losses and still says, come on, give us some more losses year after year? Or was it the alternative interpretation? Maybe those numbers don't make any sense.
Okay, so your smell test is telling you there's got to be something else going on.
That's right.
And
That the numbers don't make sense.
Okay,
So as an economist, the natural question is, what conditions are necessary for such apparent losses to appear rational or reasonable? Our answer, and Mr. Hutchings is going to elaborate on this, there were other benefits to which these expenditures should be attributed. That's the attribution problem I mentioned before. So you're counting costs, charging them to the Anashabak effectively, to the net Crown rents that may or may not be reasonable, but should not be attributed to them and generate benefits to the Crown, to Canada, to Ontario, but you're charging Anashabak for them. Okay, that's one explanation. And the other possible explanation is there are investments in the future returns that will in the future be captured. By the way, if that's the case, the negatives are just negatives that will be offset by much bigger positives in the future. So you could actually ignore the negatives because they promise that there's going to be much bigger positives going forward. But that's not how the way they do it. So let me say very clearly what my view of these two hypotheses is. Are these investments in future returns or are these misattributions? Those are the two hypotheses.
yes.
Given the magnitude and the duration of the losses, their explanation that it's investments just doesn't pass the smell test.
Thank you. Just returning for a moment to the idea that we would pay the Crown would pay someone to take the land and resources off our hands because we're losing money. If we have a hypothetical of you use 1960, I think the data shows that's when there's lots of negative amounts in Bodway and Smart's analysis coming up. If in 1961 you had let's call it just for the sake of our hypothetical, a $10 million loss. If there's no prospect that things are going to turn around and we have a period 1960 to 2019 of data already, then for that 1 year, I mean, the Crown would say, oh my gosh, we're going to lose $10 million if we keep this land. Take the land back, we'll give you 9,999,000. I mean, it should be up to the 10 million somewhere.
That's right, but they would be looking forward
Yeah,
and saying, this is a loss-making enterprise. You should think of a company that says, we're in a business that is not a loss leader. A loss leader is where you're going to get profits. This is just a sinkhole.
right.
And I'm going to lose 10 million now. If I don't get out of this business, I'm going to get 10 million lost next year, 10 million to last. And it looks like, if I look at the books, it's going up more and more every year.
The loss is
The
going up.
losses are going up. I better get out of this and find somebody willing to take this mess off of my back. And so you look around and say, you know, who will take it off my back for the least amount of money? That's not what happened. I mean, this is all hypothetical, but that's what Canada should have said. And that, you know, when it started turning a negative, say,
You mean Ontario?
I mean, Ontario should have said, when these losses started showing up, who will take this off my back? You know, maybe there's a private guy, you know, there's fools born every minute. Maybe there's a private guy that'll take it off my back for, give me a little bit for these losses. Maybe they can manage it better, but I wouldn't want to have those losses year after year.
So let's go continuing on with your slide that helps us explain what you call smell test number 3, which you've already introduced.
Yeah, so
You
this,
have to explain this graph to me.
yeah, so this just illustrates the numbers, and we did it, you know, graphically in the more relevant period, 1997 to 2018, the more recent period, I mean. There are lots of lines there.
So first of all, it relates to the forest only.
It's only forest. So we're
Okay.
just focusing on forest. And the reason is, you know, we began by saying, we're going to focus on 5 big areas. We're going to focus on mining, hydroelectric, spectrum. Forest is one of the big ones, not a surprise, because particularly at the beginning, that's what this was, a big forest. And forestry is important. So thinking, you know, one way of thinking about it is thinking about forestry as a line of business, to use that analogy I did before. And so just thinking about this as an enterprise by itself, so that we don't confuse numbers coming from mining or from other things. So that's
And you're using it as a graph to explain something.
Maybe I should have said, in their analysis, there are big losses in forestry. And those big losses in forestry account for a very large fraction of the difference, a significant amount of the difference between our interpretation of the data relevant for what should be compensated to the Anishinaabe, for our interpretation and their interpretation. So this is one of those big ticket items that I mentioned. So we're zeroing in on this particular big ticket and their interpretation and why I think it's wrong. Okay, so the bottom line are the forestry revenues.
The very bottom line it looks like it's in orange.
Yeah, it looks like it's close to zero. Okay,
So we're looking at the dotted line.
the dotted line, I'm sorry, the
Got
dotted
it.
line.
Yes,
That looks very small. I mean, if you blew up the graph, if you had a big enough graph, you can see it's not zero. Okay. The red dotted line is the forestry expenses.
all right. And those expenses and revenues, I see on the chart, it's B&S, that's Bodway and Smart's data.
That's right.
Okay.
And the difference between the two is the loss between the revenues and the expenses. And then the question is, should those expenses be attributed to generating that revenue?
The area below the orange dotted line.
Yeah, the area between the two is the loss.
Right.
Expenses exceed revenues. And the question is, are those expenses associated with generating those revenues? Or are they attributable to lots of other things? Those expenses, you do lots of other things go on related to the forest. Okay. And the rest of that chart shows the other aspects, this is for Ontario, of GDP, of value creation, if you want to think of it, associated with the forestry industry. And what we do in that is break it down into a series of things. The dark blue is the actual logging, forestry and logging. I don't know what color you call it, teal, or that would is the support activities for forestry. And then the dark green are what we call downstream activities, things like wood product manufacturing, using the products of the forest.
Just so that when you say support activities for forestry, that's not an expense, that's a revenue source.
That's a GDP, that there are people who make their living.
Selling trucks.
Exactly. Selling trucks for the forest.
Okay.
So this is a picture of all the economic activity generated on the backs of forest in Ontario. So if you want to think about it, it is the upstream and downstream forest sector. So you go all the way, you include paper manufacturing, wood product manufacturing, the support activities, and logging. And so it is important for Ontario to have a good forest, or a good forest related sector. The question is, the expenditures associated with that sector, should you allocate them, attribute them, whatever, to net crown resource revenues associated with forests? And it's very clear, it's hard to justify an attribution that puts much of that on net crown resource revenues. It makes much more sense to say a lot of that is associated with,
A lot of those expenses.
a lot of those expenses are associated with all the other aspects of forestry GDP.
So in the area up to the red line, which is the expense line, you're saying it makes sense on the smell test to say a lot of that would have been used to support the green, teal and dark blue areas.
Yeah, and other benefits. I mean, this doesn't include all the other benefits. I mean, like forests have value recreational that won't even be captured in GDP. You know, people enjoy the forest for other attributes, and so that's not even captured there. So if you're having if you have a park and you don't charge for it, that doesn't come here, but it's part of the value of the well-being of Ontario. The part of it that would generate GDP would be the tourism associated with the parks.
Can I see if I get this? This graph then on slide 76, or your final comment on it is that the GDP of forests, which is a new term for me, but all the economic activity related to forests, that economic activity has revenues and it has expenses. And the only revenues that to which the Crown is attributing expenses are those revenues that would have been shared.
Yeah, in the boat, it effectively with some
Mhm.
wrinkle, in the Boatway and Smart methodology, they're attributing the expenses for managing,
Of the entire economic activity related to forests.
and
They're only attributing it to logging.
and for that part of logging that they capture.
The logging that generates what can be called an NCR.
That's right.
Okay.
So this big giant thing, all of which needs
This big giant thing being the green and
All
teal
the
and
colors
blue.
on the chart.
all the colors on the chart, they deserve support. But they're attributing all of this we did just for the NC, as if all of it was done just for the NCRRs. And that's why you wind up with a negative thing. Otherwise, if you thought of this as only associated with generating NCRRs, this would be a really stupid thing to do.
How many trees would be cut if that was the case?
Yeah, I mean, and
No, I was a question.
More.
No, if
Oh.
you're losing money every single day on every single tree you cut, you'd not cut any trees.
exactly. I mean, their view is this is a loss. This is a loss-making enterprise. From the point of view with their narrow activity, it's a loss-making. And every time we cut a tree, we will make more losses. Let's just shut it down. But you don't want to shut it down because it creates a lot of value. And the last remark I made was this calculation on GDP doesn't even capture the total value for society. Ontario, you have to go beyond GDP and say, look at, people enjoy the forest, people enjoy the parks. You capture a little bit of this in tourism, but there are lots of things you don't capture in tourism that are reflected in the value of nature. We don't capture biodiversity. We don't capture, so there are lots of things we don't capture. Carbon sequestration. So what we're saying is GDP is a part of the total societal value. The forestry logging is only a small part of GDP, which is a small part of the total societal value. The rents are a part of the logging activity, and the directly captured rents are a small part of that. But then to say we're going to attribute all the costs, or basically all the costs of the expenses of managing the forest to that little part at the bottom, the Crown can directly appropriates, chooses to appropriate, is not appropriate. It's put another way, you have to have a balance between what you're claiming on the expense side and what you look at on the revenue side.
Right.
And they just lost that balance.
Thank you. You continue on at slide 77, if it's appropriate to turn to that now.
Yeah, this is a way of summarizing what I just tried to say. These are, the losses are largely attributable to large losses associated with forestry management. Those large losses are a result of large expenses. And the key mistake was attributing almost all the expenses associated with forestry to NCRRs rather than apportioning expenses. NCR forestry revenues, a small share of total forestry revenues, let alone forestry GDP, let alone total societal value.
You just said a small share of total forestry revenues. and-
Rents, I mean, total forestry, well, total forestry revenues and those rents are a share of revenues,
Yes,
okay? And let alone forestry GDP, and then I said forestry GDP is actually only part of the value created to society by the forest. And so the bottom line is there are multiple benefits from forestry management. And you don't want to attribute all those just to the NCRRs.
well, more than just you don't want to.
You
and
shouldn't. You shouldn't. And if you do, you wind up with what I would say in technical language, cockamamie results. Results that just don't make any sense. The last point I make on the slide is that you can think of these as being reasonable. I'm not saying that the Crown made a mistake not to spend the money. That's not the issue.
When you
here.
say these, you're referring to expenses generally.
The expenses that were so high relative to the net Crown revenues. That's not, whatever their expenses were, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done that. That's not the issue here. They make sense if it increases in sum the direct Crown revenues, the indirect Crown revenues, and all the other societal benefits. So it was reasonable for the Crown to have done those expenses. It may have been reasonable. I didn't, but it was not. It may have been reasonable for them to make those, to do that spending, but the justification has to do with direct Crown revenues, indirect Crown revenues, and all the other societal benefits. And if those benefits exceed the cost, then yes, it makes sense to do that.
So that's the answer to why they didn't say take it back.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I would not have advised Canada, the
Or
Crown
Ontario.
to sell, to give it away and give them a lot of money. It was Crown was doing the right thing. The only mistake here was Professor Bodaway and Smart's attribution of all those costs to the net Crown resource revenue. And that number then, once you think about it this way, that $7.9 billion loss is an error in calculation. It isn't, those expenses should not have been put on the backs of the net Crown revenues.
When you say an error in calculation, not a mathematical error, it's a methodological
It's a
error.
conceptual error. They should not have
Conceptual.
subtracted those expenses. Exactly.
So you continue on with a thought experiment that, as I understand the chart, kind of helps explain. I think earlier on today, you testified about one of the options or one of the possibilities is that sometime in the future, the forest will be worth more. And that's what this thought experiment is about.
Yeah. So
It's to test the theory of Bodaway and Smart.
one of the two hypotheses was that don't worry about the losses because these are really investments in the future,
That's what Bodaway and Smart say.
effectively.
Okay, and this chart is to try and explain why you disagree.
That's not
with that.
plausible.
Okay, so explain that to us.
So what I've just explained so far, let me put why I think it's a problem of attribution, that the losses are not real losses from a societal point of view. You just should not have attributed all those losses to the net crown resource revenues.
When you say losses, you mean expenses, or do you
I
mean?
mean,
losses?
the expenses, you should not have attributed the expenses to the net crown resource revenues, okay? And the other one is, well, these are losses that are, whenever you make an investment, you spend money and then you get a return. And we haven't yet gotten the returns. So these are reasonable expenses, reasonably attributable to logging activities and other activities that will generate direct net crown revenues, okay? Resource revenues. And this shows how unpersuasive that theory, that hypothesis is. So what the bottom line there, the blue line shows the revenues. And what it shows is revenues remain relatively steady, increasing a little bit until around 2008, and then they went down, and now then they start going up again.
Now, just let me stop you there. The blue line is revenues identified by Bodway and Smart, right?
That's right.
Okay.
So we're basically using data from their nominal values report.
Okay.
The orange line are the expenses attributed.
Again, by Bodway and Smart.
That's right. And you notice that it was around 1960 that the expenses start exceeding the revenues, and they start making losses. And on this, you might say, on this business line, okay? And we asked a simple hypothetical question. Let's say that somehow from when this chart was done, this is all in real dollars, expenses stayed the same. Okay, that's that dotted line on the orange going forward. And expenses stay the same. And let's say revenues somehow grow at 5% a year, which, as you can see, is much faster than they've grown historically. Historically, they haven't grown very much. So let's really, give them a lot of benefit of doubt and say they really soar. It won't be until 2070 that they break even. So
That the crown breaks even.
that the crown breaks even.
How realistic is this 5%?
Well, what that says is the crown would have encountered 100 years of losses, more than 100 years of losses, before it breaks even. Now, I know, there are deep pockets and, but most businesses don't say, I'm going to have 100 years of losses before I begin to break even. And that's on the hypothesis of a 5% increase in revenues that I've never experienced in the previous 100 years. So it just doesn't make sense that you could think of this as expenses incurred in order to make a profit. Or to put it in another way, using their methodology for an agreement made in 1950, it would take an incredible rate of increase in revenues beyond 2070 to make the value of the vast forest positive. Let me put it another way. In other words, if you were making an agreement in 1950 and you were going through that hypothetical question in in the ground of whether we should keep the forest or get rid of them. Okay, is it net positive or negative? Then in order for it to be positive, the blue line has to be above the orange line by enough when you discount it back
Yes.
to be positive, okay? And that would take a lot. We haven't done the precise calculation, but it just puts you in the area of incredible. And that's why I say it fails the smell test.
Okay. And there's one more point I want to make about this graph. In the 2070 year, where the costs through this very high 5% rate meets expenses. Before the initial, under Bodway and Smart's analysis, before the Anishinaabe would be able to share anything, all the costs would have, the accumulated costs. So in 2071, there might be a net revenue from that source, but that would just go to reduce the ongoing negative amount.
Exactly. So if you want to think about what this implies for sharing,
Yes.
what this would say, focusing just on the forestry sector, we can't expect any positive value going to the Anishinaabe from forest activity until what, well into the next century. So don't expect any share, any check from forestry for all those vast forests until well into the next century.
And that's based on rates of return that are just unrealistic.
Exact, and that itself is based on, unrealistic numbers. And by the way, if you discover a new mine, don't expect anything out of that new mine either, because that mine has to just offset the losses we're making on the forestry because of the way we've managed the forest. So, just take it. You're not going to get anything for whatever is discovered in the future in this territory.
It's close to 11:35 now.
Thank you.
How long did the court wish to break?
I'd like 20 minutes, please. 10 to,
Yes.
does that work? Thank you.
This court will recess until 11:50. Thank you.
All rise.
This court is now resumed. You may be seated.
Professor Stiglitz, before we move to the summary of results, part of the slide deck.
Court's indulgence. Do you mind putting your microphone on?
Didn't realize it got turned off.
Neither did
Thank
I.
you. Before we move, Professor Stiglitz, to your summary of results and conclusions, which is part of the slide deck presentation, I wanted to ask a couple questions for which we don't have a slide deck, but are contained within either your opening report or your reply report, and some issues I wanted to address. First issue has to do with the complaint or the assertion that part of what you do was wrong because the Crown could not charge anything other than the low direct fees in order to be competitive. And it's the argument that is to say, look, we had to charge only what we charged, and we couldn't have charged more, and therefore there wouldn't be any resource extractors coming into the territory, and therefore all of your value approach is interesting but meaningless. And I'm paraphrasing their argument.
Yeah.
It's in their report, but that's the gist of the complaint. Can you address how why you believe what you believe about that complaint about your approach?
So, yeah, obviously, I think it's wrong. And let me try to explain why. In our rent analysis, we asked the question, we took the revenues, the gross revenues, and then we subtracted out the labor, capital, supplier expenses, and each of them got their competitive return. So capital got its competitive return, risk adjusted, okay? Now, the basic notion of capitalism is that there's entrepreneurs out there, firms out there willing to produce, to enter the market if they can get anything greater than that competitive risk-adjusted return. So if the Crown had charged, say, a mining license that would have extracted the rents fully, they still would have gotten,
Who's they?
the mining company would still have gotten their normal expected risk-adjusted return.
Okay.
And so if there were any excess over that, they'd be willing to enter. So you didn't have to give them more to have entry. So that's the way capitalism works.
So let me just try, can you just sort of put that into a concrete example of whether you leave the resources, when a capitalist would leave resources in the ground versus take it out?
Well, there is an additional wrinkle to this that arises from depletable natural resources like a mineral. And that is, even if there were nobody today willing to extract it, the resources don't disappear. They're there. And so to say I'm afraid of nobody coming is to say I'm afraid of nobody coming, not only today, but tomorrow, the day after, the year after, 10 years, 50 years, because it's not like you have something of value. And in fact, naturally over time, with the scarcity of natural resources increasing over time, that's even getting more valuable by waiting. So when you say I'm afraid of nobody coming in to extract it, what you're really saying is I'm afraid of nobody extracting it ever. And that just doesn't make sense. That the natural forces of market economy say that if you give somebody the normal risk-adjusted return, there'll be entry.
And your rents model includes in allowing those resource extractors that are reasonable profit.
Exactly.
I want to turn to I guess what I would call following your verbiage, a fourth smell test involving Booth and Kersner's work.
Okay.
And I guess the first place to start, there's a slide of, I just want to just to introduce the subject. We have a slide, it's not part of your slide deck, but this comes from, I think, Canada's opening. Yeah. and from Booth and Kersner, and they, it is how they approach assigning different rates of return to different expenditures by the Anishinaabe, which they presume, but this is their approach to identifying how to bring forward. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to unpack that a little bit and to try and have your take on some of the methodological, what I think are methodological problems about their approach. And so can we please go to page 60 of 80 of your reply report, please? And Ms. Lewis, I think, is going to try and bring that up on the computer or on the. All right, so what we have on page 60 of 80 is we've got a table 3 that has B and K, and that's Booth and Kersner. And they have a real return and a depreciation rate. And I want to focus on each one, but I want to start on business for a moment. And so the first is that they have business that starts at 8.2%. And you told us this morning about the difference between a real rate of return and a nominal rate of return. So this 8.2% is the real rate of return after taking into account inflation.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And then they've got an amount for depreciation of 5%.
That's right.
And so, as I understand it, you would take the 8.2%, you'd minus the 5%, and you'd be left with 3.2%.
I wouldn't do that, but that's what they did.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
So-
So explain why you think what they've done is wrong, I suppose.
Okay, so the number that they use for returns, which is the issue that we've had to deal with over and over again, is to say you take the real return and you subtract the depreciation on the capital, and you get a net of depreciation real return of 3.2% for a category, important category of investment called business investment. And the reason that I think that fails the smell test is very simple. You could have invested over this period, and they in their own report mention this, the average real return in the stock market is around 7.5% in a diversified portfolio.
This is something Booth and Kersner's
I
talk
think
about.
that's right, later in
Okay.
their reply report. And if you can get a return of 7.5% in the stock market in a diversified portfolio versus 3.2% in one asset, which is not very diversified, it's very clear which you would prefer. The 7.5 in a diversified portfolio is both safer and more than twice the return on business. So if their numbers were right,
Which numbers?
if the 3.2% number were right, nobody would engage in business. Now, people do engage in business. So we know that reasoning had to be flawed. And so the question is, where, just like we did in the other case, you'd say, what went wrong? And actually it's not that complicated.
For an economist.
For an
yes.
economist, okay. 8.2% is actually a net real return that you get in business. And if you got a net real return of 8.2, then business is worth doing because you get a little bit of extra return, you have a little bit more risk and relative to the stock market. And so you get investment. So effectively, they confuse the real return of 8.2. They think of that as a gross return when it's already netted of depreciation. To put it another way, if that were the kinds of returns on business, 3.2, you would ask the question, how could the stock market yield a return of 7.5%? Stock market is based on businesses getting returns, including taking into account the depreciation of their assets. And they're yielding 7.5% real. And that B&K are claiming
Booth and
3.2%.
Kersner, B&K.
Are claiming this 3.2%. It just doesn't comport.
Okay, and just because we're still on this subject and if it's helpful to anyone, you mentioned somewhere Booth and Kersner said it's 7.5%, and my notes suggest it's at their surreply, page 7 at paragraph 17.
Okay.
If anyone's
Yeah.
keeping track of that. But let's just go on and talk about what went wrong. Why is the depreciation to take 5% depreciation off? Why doesn't that make sense? And I don't know if you can give us use a sort of like a hypothetical example, like you've done so well in the last couple days of testimony that made sense to me when it gets down to examples.
Okay, let me give a very simple example of a hypothetical investment that cost $100, and it's a machine lasts 5 years, and each year of the 5 years, it generates $30 return. Okay, so it's a 5-year investment, $100, 30 return each year. And let's forget about time value for a second. And 30 times 5 is 150. So the gross return is 150. The net return, 150 minus the $100 investment, is 50. 50 earned over 5 years is 10. And the rate of return is roughly 10%. 10 divided by 100, 10%. Okay, now that's the net return on capital. Okay, let's say we now make their mistake, Booth and Kirshner mistake, and subtract depreciation. What is depreciation? It's a $100 investment. It lives 5 years. So each year we're deducting $20 for depreciation if we use straight line depreciation. Okay, so that's 20% annual depreciation. So we have the 10% return. They say we should now take a deduction of depreciation, which is minus 20%.
When you say they say, you mean in your hypothetical example?
In this hypothetical example, if you subtract out depreciation, you take 10% minus 20%, you get a return for this project, which is very high return project of a minus 10%.
And you're saying that's not possible.
Well, that's a wrong way of thinking about it. So there's another way that I think I can maybe clarify of where of where the confusion arises. Remember I said it's $100 investment
Yes.
yielding $30 every year. The gross return is 30%. 30 over 100, 30% every year.
Yes.
Now you take that gross return, 30%, and you deduct depreciation. That was 20%. You get 10%. And that's the number that I said was the right number for the return on that investment. So it's very, very important to make sure that the number from which you are subtracting depreciation is the gross return, not the net return. And the number that appears in the usual accounts on, what is the return to business of 8.2% is a net return, not a gross return. And so because so it's already taken into account the finite life of capital goods. So it's like double counting the depreciation. And that's why you get these numbers that don't pass the smell test. So, and we're going to get that problem over and over and over again in their analyses.
So let's sort of stick with our $100 investment machine or whatever. You didn't actually say what kind of machine, it doesn't matter. But after the end of 5 years, what are you left with in terms of the machine and the money?
It's gone.
So
It's dead.
Right.
It's a 5-year project, and you put your money in, you get your returns each year, and that's the end of the analysis.
So the $100 you invested is gone after 5 years,
Oh, yeah, that's right.
but then you have $150 because so the $100 you invested yielded. Maybe I'm sorry.
No,
I
no,
think
you're
I'm
good.
maybe confusing
Well,
things.
let me-
Yeah.
So at the end of 5 years, you have this $150. Your machine has disappeared. You're
Your
now-
money-making machine.
Your money-making machine. That's a good way to.
But your investment is still there.
But your money is there. You have this.
Your money's in your pocket.
Your money's in your pocket,
How much money?
$150.
You started with
Now-
100, you bought a machine, it made you 150, now you have 150.
What can you do?
Money-making machine is gone,
You can buy another,
you can buy another machine for $100.
and in fact, you
No.
buy 1.5 machines. So you buy $150 worth of money-making machines. And then they last another 5 years.
Or you go on a trip.
Well, if you're an investor, and you're, okay, so the point of this is it compounds at the rate of 10% a year. So every year, I mean, I did it 5 years and then 5 years and then 5 years, but we have many of these machines going on making money, and they compound each at 10% a year. And so what is the compound rate of return? It's 10%. And we described it as a 5-year machine. It could be a 10-year machine, it could be, whatever. But this is all hypothetical to try to illustrate that the net rate of return that you're supposed to be compounding at is this 10% number,
And
not minus 10%.
right.
If you got minus 10%, you would be getting poorer and poorer. And, the minus maybe sound exaggerated, but really the point I want to make is that if you double count depreciation, obviously you're going to wind up with a lower rate of return than you ought to. And in fact, it won't pass the smell test.
Okay, but you've used an example where the depreciation rate was 20%. That they've used a depreciation rate of 5%. Does it really matter for your
No.
example?
So 5% would be a 20-year machine.
Right.
So if I had a 20-year machine that was this money-making machine, and generated, the corresponding return, then I would have a 5% depreciation rate, but I want to take it off of the gross return, not out of the net return. And if I look at my net return and then depreciate, I'll get the wrong number.
And that's what you say Bodway and Smart did.
That's right. Oh, no, with,
Booth and Kersner, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you, council. Can we then go back to page 60 where the table 3 is? And the next one I want to talk about is education. And when we look at education, we have a real rate of return of 10% and then a depreciation rate of 4%. And for the same reason, we don't need to belabor the point about depreciation. You say that's wrong.
well,
Or-
I do need maybe to belabor it because.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
What I want to emphasize is the numbers that they quote in the first column. The numbers 10%, 8.2, 5.5, 5.0, those are numbers. I won't talk where they came from, but where we'll talk about that in a little bit, but those are net numbers. They're not even net numbers. I'll explain that in a minute, but what they, I mean, they're the kinds of numbers that are net of depreciation. You follow?
Right. They might
So-
be the wrong numbers, but they should be net of depreciation.
Exactly. And so if you have net of depreciation, then when you subtract depreciation, you get an unreasonable number. That's really the point I want to make. So, but that in fact, if you look at the literature, the numbers on the returns to education are much higher. The net numbers that you get on the return to education are much higher than that 10%.
And can you sort of provide an explanation of that for us?
Well, there are two points. One, lots of studies on what are the returns to education. And let me explain maybe how we calculate the returns to education. We look at what's a high school graduate gets relative to one that doesn't graduate high school, or a college graduate relative to one that doesn't graduate from college. So that's the change in income. And then we look at the cost. The cost of education actually is not just the cost of our teachers and our buildings but also the foregone income. The person could have been working and he spent his time in school. So we take a fairly comprehensive view of the cost. And then we ask the question, okay, getting an education, you pay this amount upfront when you're in school. And then you look at the change in income 1 year after graduation, 2 years after, 5 years, 10 years, and all the way until you retire. And so it's a finite length of time. Unfortunately, it lasts only, and that's what they mean by depreciation. It doesn't last forever. It comes to an end. So the
income stream differential
income stream comes
comes to an end because there's something called
death.
death.
Yeah, okay.
Got
So
it.
after that, everybody gets.
Or decreased earning ability.
Yes, it
First, it
definitely
comes
diminished, unless you're Elvis, you know.
So anyway, eventually that number gets down to zero, but there's a stream of positives. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you ask, what is the return, the extra amount you got, just like we did on the hypothetical money machine. We ask, here we have an education machine. We put in money up front, the education, and then we look at what are the stream of returns and we calculate the return. And lots of people have done that. And the general, the kinds of numbers that have one gets are around 15%. That includes the fact, when they say 15%, they recognize that people die. And economists are not that bad. So they look at what are the limits on that differential.
Yes.
And so they take into account that limited life.
And so that's taking into account depreciation then, I take
And
it.
that's taking into account depreciation. So it's a net return
You said around 15%.
is around 15%.
And if you go to page 63 of your report, I believe this is where you have some empirical studies about that. That's why you,
Is this the reply
the
still?
reply report.
Thank you.
I apologize. The reply report, yes.
Okay,
So the kinds of things that we talk, there are a variety of technical problems, but this is at the bottom of paragraph 140 on that page, rates of return 14 to 60%, and others, depending female, male, 17 to 11.8%. But that's the kind of range that one gets. But there's one more thing that I would call attention to, which is something that I was very sensitive to when I was chief economist of the World Bank. When there are a lot of deprivations, you have low levels of education, the returns on the getting it up to basic levels of education, high school or even 6th grade, are higher than this. The returns to education postgraduate may be relatively low, but the returns, what we're talking about, the education that would have been spent on the Anashabik, those returns are probably higher than these numbers of 15%.
would this be a good time for me to ask a question?
Sure.
And this goes back to a comment I think I made Friday when we were talking about investments in, for instance, health and education. And I said, but the return is in the hand of the individual. And I think, Mr. Schachter, you said, or in the building of a health center or something like that. So if I go back to what you just said, sir, you said, so the cost of an education is not just the teachers and the buildings, it's also the foregone income. But then when you're calculating this return, are you looking at the cost of the buildings and teachers, or are you just looking at the difference in the individual's hand? I paid this much in tuition, if there was tuition from kindergarten to grade 6, or from grade 6 to grade 12, and my income differential is now X, and that's a 15% rate of return.
Most of this is what is called the social return to education. So we look at societal costs,
And also societal benefits.
but including the benefits that go to the individual. We're not talking about the benefits appropriated by the government,
Mhm.
but we're treating $1 to the individual as a benefit of $1 to society.
Okay,
So these are not, this is an analysis is in some sense response to Booth and Kirchner's report, where they're saying, how is the money actually spent? Okay, but what we're doing here is looking at the actual returns to education from the point of view of the Anashabik as a whole,
okay.
that the individual forego it, but if he had worked, the society and the individual would have had income.
Okay, so
And
that if you have 100 people who increase their education and increase their income, that's a societal benefit,
that's right.
and that's what's being measured.
That's right. That's right. We could do the narrow, how much of that government captured in general, as I mentioned before, it's
Mhm.
25 to 35%. They're only capturing a part of that.
Mhm.
And they're only paying part of the cost
Right,
as well, because they pay, depending on how you run your education system, they may not pay any tuition at all, but we would include the cost of the schooling, even if they didn't pay any tuition. You found,
Yes.
the education still costs something. So this is that kind of social calculation.
okay,
And I say, these kinds of studies have been done over and over again. And particularly when there are impoverished people where there's been deprivations of the kind that we have here, the rates of return are quite high. And that was why, in fact, when I was at World Bank, real emphasis on how important it was to invest in education
So,
in developing
so
countries.
what's your conclusion about Booth and Kersner's net 4%, is it, or net 6% return on education?
That it's much too low.
I want to, at this moment, because some of the questions the court just asked, just to make clear that although we're going through this exercise of, in effect, critiquing Booth and Kersner and explaining why their numbers aren't wrong, you don't endorse their methodological approach.
No, but I think it is instructive to understand what the rates of return that one could have obtained from good investments and infrastructure and health. So even though I think their methodology is wrong, pedagogically, often I go through a bad paper in my class to illustrate certain points that are instructive.
Okay. So I guess going back to your page 60 in the table, the next one I'd like you to comment on is infrastructure. And here we have 5.5 minus 3.3 leaves us with, I guess, 2.2. I hope I did that right.
Yes, your arithmetic seems to be right.
That's about the extent about the math that I could do. But what does the 2.2% rate of return tell you about Booth and Kersner's infrastructure returns?
It doesn't pass the smell test again. I mean, look at if that were the return to infrastructure, we shouldn't have passed the infrastructure bill in the United States that a lot of us celebrated. You would say, oh, what a mistake. We should have been spending that money on something else. If we could only get 2.2% on infrastructure, there are a lot of other investments. Just put the money in stock market and we could have gotten 7.5%. Why would we want to make infrastructure?
because you need the buildings and the roads and the hospitals.
Yeah, but that's because they yield a return a lot bigger than 2.2%. All the studies, let me put, all the studies on the return to infrastructure show a return of much higher than 2.2%. And that's why economists were very enthusiastic when we passed the infrastructure bill in the United States. It wasn't that it was going to yield this measly 2.2%. It was going to, because it was going to yield a much higher rate of return. And just again, I don't want to keep referring to some of my experience. When I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, we asked this question: where should we be spending money? And we did kinds of calculations about returns on health, education, and infrastructure. And the returns on infrastructure were actually higher than on the ordinary return to the private sector. And our view was the infrastructure was being starved. And starved, what does that mean? The returns are higher than for other kinds of investment.
Now I appreciate that, again, your preferred approach is the 60-40 bring forward approach, but if one were to go down this road of trying to sort out what rates of return on education, health and infrastructure, can I take you to page 67 of your reply report? Because here I think is where you try to explain the more realistic rates of return on infrastructure. So it's page 67 of 80.
Yeah.
Paragraph 151, I think.
Yeah. So I I talked about the data for the United States, and in in our report, we looked at the Canadian data, and it talked about a nominal return of 17%. And then adjusted for inflation, that would bring you back to a real return of around 15%, which is consistent with my view, is that it's substantially higher than the net 2% low rate that we talked about a minute ago.
So looking at Booth and Kersner's work in this sort, yes, Booth and Kersner, looking at their work, where does that 2.2% come in, and does it relate to something called the social discount rate?
Yeah, so
what
an actual
happened?
question, just like, when we got these absurd results in the first smell test,
Yeah.
where the Anishinaabe got 1%, we said, how in the world did they get that peculiar result? And we went back and analyzed the sources of the flaw in their methodology.
And their methodology being Booth and Kersner's.
Well, that was in the Bodway.
Oh, and Bodway and
But
Smart.
what I want to say is, just like here, we went back and tried to look through their report,
Oh,
and you had to go back to the appendix to figure out where that number came from.
and we're looking at Booth and Kersner's report
Now
now.
we're
Okay,
going-
sorry, I apologize for
Okay,
confusing the matter.
So we went back, and in the appendix, they explain it comes from the use of a concept called the social discount rate. And let me try to explain what the social discount rate is. It's a number that's used for quite a different purpose. Governments, when they're trying to decide whether they should undertake a project, ask the question, what is the minimal rate of return that we need to get on the project for it to be worthwhile? So it's the way to look at it, it's a minimal acceptable rate of return. It's not the average return that we would have is being received. It's sort of the threshold below which we won't accept a project. And of course, you would expect the average return that you get to be significantly higher than the minimal acceptable rate.
So it's measuring two different things then.
It's two totally different things. So you would never want to use the social discount rate as a measure of what you actually obtained. In fact, it's biased, because for public projects, it's a minimum rate that you should be getting.
And so that harkens back to your comment about you make an analysis about whether you would spend any money. It's got to at least meet the social discount rate.
That's right. So if
Okay.
you do your analysis right, you would always wind up with something bigger and possibly substantially bigger.
Can you, just to make this point, sorry, let me ask the question. And Booth and Kersner's infrastructure amount of 2.2% net, is the social discount rate?
That's my understanding from the their appendix.
Okay. And if- I don't know if you know this, but my notes say that it's from appendix, that these numbers come from Appendix C in Booth and Kersner's rebuttal present value report. Yep,
That's right.
okay.
So it is the social discount rate or it's net of the social discount?
No,
It
no,
is
so the number, let me say, the number that they used, the,
Page 60, I think.
yeah,
Page
thank
60
you.
was the chart.
Wait, the chart.
Page 60 of 80 in your reply report. Yeah.
Yeah, so my understanding, as far as I can read, is that the infrastructure of 5.5 comes from their reading in the literature of what the social discount rate is for infrastructure. And then they say, okay, we take that social discount rate and take off of that a depreciation factor of 3.3. So that depreciation problem we've already dealt with. I don't want to go through that
It's a
again.
separate problem.
That's a separate problem. The question is, where in the world did that 5.5% come from? Given that the data says the numbers should be more in the range of 15%
Net.
net.
Okay.
And in fact, I mean, net, they claim it should be 2.2%, they being Booth and Kersner,
Yeah. But go ahead.
2.2%. And here these numbers are all, they're greater than that number.
So both numbers come from the literature. One's the literature of the social discount rate, and one is the literature on the rate of return from investment in infrastructure.
Yeah, experienced investment. What was our experience in the returns to infrastructure? Okay. And the question is, which of these two is relevant? And obviously, if you're asking what would have happened if we had put our money in, it's a counterfactual because they didn't get the money. But if they had put their money in infrastructure, what would they have gotten? And the answer is, the appropriate answer, I'll modify that in a second. The appropriate answer is they would have gotten something like the average return that other Canadians had experienced. Okay. And that would have been a number like 14, 15% net of depreciation,
Right.
not the 2.2%. Now, the point is, the modification I was going to say, because they were probably infrastructure deprived, the actual returns would be higher than that. It was something, a law in economics, you probably all studied, the law of diminishing returns. And so the first investments, when you're infrastructure deprived, yield even a higher return. So looking at the average return is probably an underestimate of what they would have obtained. And then I was trying to explain why not only is the social discount rate the wrong framework, because you're not asking the question. The relevant question is, what was a minimum rate you would obtain? It's what the actual rate you would have obtained. But it is not a surprise that the social discount rate is low, because the minimum that you would have accepted is obviously going to be lower than the average that you actually obtain.
Now, do you, again, just because I like simple examples of machines, do you have an example that you can sort of just walk us through why the social discount rate doesn't make sense?
So the machine that I want to talk about is a machine that can take carbon out of the atmosphere. Okay, so we helps protect us against climate change.
An area you know something about.
Yeah, so you have all this, okay, so you have this machine and it can take out CO2 and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And we actually know how to value that social value of the carbon. And in the United States, we have a number of what the social cost of carbon is, and people are getting a better idea of what that social cost of carbon is. So we can do it from a social, but there's actually markets for carbon that are being created. So we could either do a social or private. Either way, we can talk about of this. There's both a social and a private value of this machine that takes out carbon.
Okay.
And you ask a question, what is the social discount rate for that kind of investment, infrastructure investment? Now, that kind of infrastructure investment is extraordinarily valuable because we want to protect ourselves against climate change. The cost of climate change is going to be enormous. And so you ask the question, what is the minimal rate of return that you would accept for a machine
To build our carbon sucking machine.
a machine that takes carbon out of the atmosphere? Okay. And the general consensus is the rate of return that should be very, very low, 1%. Okay. Something lower than that. So let's use that social discount rate as column 1 in there of infrastructure for related to carbon. And let's say that machine lasts for 10 years. That would mean we'd have to depreciate it over 10 years. In their methodology, that would yield a negative 9%.
So 1% return minus, as compared to 10% depreciation.
Yeah.
Okay. So where does that take us then?
And that says in their analysis of what you should be compensated for that, if you did any investment of that kind, you ought to get negative compensation for the time value of money. It just, again, doesn't make any sense. So what is the right number? The enormous value in this carbon reducing machine. So we want to put in not the minimum rate that we would accept, but the real social value that this carbon machine, or private value, if we can sell the carbon credits,
Right.
will yield. And that just highlights the difference between using the social discount rate, where you might even wind up with a negative number, and using what is appropriate here, which is the returns that you would get from the investment. I'm just using that hypothetical to make clear the very, very deep difference between social discount rate, which is measuring one thing, and the returns to society, or the returns to the people, or returns from a particular category of investment.
And the last one that I wanted to turn to was the healthcare, which again, on page 60, on the chart, there's a reference to healthcare. 5% real return minus 4% depreciation is, as we've found out, understand now, it's a 1% rate of return on healthcare. What do you have to say about that?
I mean, that's obviously the most absurd of the, it doesn't pass the smell test. If as an American looking at Canada's healthcare system, we think that your investments in health are one of the great things of Canada. And we look around in the United States, it gets me on another topic, but why does the United States have declining life expectancy? Declining, health standard? Because one of the reasons, just one, is that we haven't been investing enough in healthcare publicly. And we see the consequences of that. And it affects productivity. It has huge social costs, absenteeism, people who have to take out days for sickness. And the fact is that number, 1% net return on healthcare is so different from all the literature, economic literature on what is the net return to healthcare.
The 5%, does that have anything to do with social discount rate?
Yeah, that's why that number is so low. Let me say, I don't know where they got that. I mean, even as a social discount rate, it's not a number that I would use, but whatever that number is, the fact is that what is relevant here is what is the return to investments in healthcare. And it's far more than 1%.
If you turn to page 65 of 80 of your report, you talk about what you, in your understanding, think that the proper rate of return on healthcare is.
Well,
Can you opine on that?
yeah. Again, I want to go back to my experience as chief economist at the World Bank, where this was one of the areas where we put a lot of money because we thought there were very high returns, particularly among poor people. But this is a study in developed countries, and the returns, the median. This was a meta study with what is called a meta study, where you look at many different studies, and the median overall return on investment was 14.3%. So that
Go ahead, go
clearly
ahead.
greater, and that's net.
That's net, not, but in your looking at Booth and Kersner's 5%, never mind the depreciation, but in there looking at 5%, was the 5% have anything to do with the social discount rate, or you don't know where they got it from?
Well, I think they got it from some set of studies of social discount rate.
Okay.
It was, they looked at a couple of studies where that was done. They were not, they looked around the literature for a social discount rate that was done for a healthcare study. But what my remark was, I don't think you could justify 5% as an appropriate social discount rate for healthcare. But I didn't do a lot of more looking, partly because I didn't think it was relevant. What is relevant here is what is the actual rates of return. And those are significantly higher than that 5%.
So you would have used, if I just think of your example with the, as Mr. Schachter called it, the carbon sucking machine. You said the social discount rate might have been 1%. So you would have used a lower.
I would have used a lower, that's right. I would have used for a social discount rate a lower number. And then I would have used for the actual experience a higher number. You got it, exactly.
The actual experience being the actual real rate of return.
Yeah, exactly. And improved productivity, there are ways, these are a little bit harder to measure because you have to measure the value of life, the value of quality of life, but there are standard procedures, and they all come with a consensus that the rate of return is very high. 15% is a reasonable number, but not 1%, which is what they come up with.
Justice Hennessy, I'm mindful of the time and people might need breaks. I probably have about half an hour to 40 minutes left of direct examination. I think Mr. Gover has a few questions that he wanted to ask. What is the court's preference?
What's your question? Whether we should break for lunch?
Yes.
Should we take a hands-up approach?
How's the witness feeling?
I think it's a long time to go without a break.
Yeah.
I think, how about a break from,
The Crowns have already indicated they're not starting their cross until tomorrow anyways.
right? Let's take a break till 2.
Okay.
If that works, everybody can get to bed. Okay, thank you.
This court will recess until 2 o'clock. Thank you. This court is now resumed. You may be seated. I'm not entirely sure how we did that.
Good afternoon, Professor Stiglitz. We have a few more questions to go. First place I want to start is we know from the reports that people have seen that Booth and Kersner rely heavily on the past spending decisions of some of the Anishinaabe bands. They do a study of some of them and say these are their past spending patterns, and the past spending patterns matter. What do you say to that? Do you agree with that, that the past spending patterns actually matter?
No, no, I don't. And let me try to explain why. When people, a group of people are in poverty, their behavior is very different from when they're lifted out of poverty. When they're living day to day, they almost inevitably think short-sighted. And there's lots of research that supports this. You know, their mental activities are focused on survival, and that leads to short-sightedness. It's hard to think about the long term when you don't know whether you're going to survive in the short term. So the notion that a pattern of spending for somebody with, remember how low that income was?
Yes.
In the chart I gave, somebody at that level of income, those spending patterns are not probative or not relevant to what the spending patterns would be if you narrowed that gap between, if you eliminated those deprivations.
And does it matter whether it's individual or collective as to how spending is used?
Yeah, obviously, it does. If you gave money to a collective with the responsibility of improving the well-being of the collective, that collective is going to think about the collective, and therefore their spending pattern will focus on areas that we saw a few minutes ago where before lunch were high return collective expenditures, like on public education, public provision of health infrastructure. And so you'd expect more of the spending to go into that form than into other forms.
I wonder then if we could sort of tackle the point of consumption. Now, consumption, as I understand Booth and Kersner's views, deals with things that are used up. So getting a little money, buying a sandwich instead of investing it at a 60-40 investment. That's what I think they mean by consumption. And I believe it's not disputed that Booth and Kersner say consumption only attracts inflation returns. Am I correct in that?
They're saying in their framework,
Yes.
they give a return to that part of spending that goes into consumption. They attribute a return that corresponds to inflation, which corresponds in turn to a zero real rate of return. So what they're saying is, in effect, that the Anishinaabe should be compensated for their spending that went into consumption. That part of that, they call it a portfolio, that part of that spending, they should be compensated at a zero rate of return.
And does that make sense to you? And if not, why not?
No, it doesn't make sense. And to put it in a simplest way, going back to what I said before about there being at a very low level of let me say, a very high level of deprivation. Investments in survival are really investments that have a very high rate of return. If you don't survive, nothing else is relevant. So to say that the spending on nutrition to survive is not a investment that should get any return doesn't make any sense. One could put it in other ways, in ways that many economists would might put it, is that the value of $1 to somebody who is at the edge is much higher than
At the poverty edge.
What?
At the poverty edge.
At the poverty edge, or the edge of survival, is much higher than the value of $1 to somebody who is much better off. And so back in 1850, they were worse off than they are today. What we said, we showed in that graph that they've gotten better off, not in proportion to the wealth of the territory, but they are better off now than they were before. And that means the value of $1 back in 1850 is greater. So that would mean that in normal analyses of the time value of money, even on the consumption part, you would want to show some real return.
Does economics or the study of economics or economic theory, does it have anything to say about our reasonable person having money for a sandwich and faced with the choice of eating it to sustain himself or to invest it? Does that tell us anything about that individual's rate of return? Maybe I'm not asking the
I'm
question.
not
right.
sure.
I'll try
But
to.
let me maybe put it in another way. If you had given, in our analysis, we postulate that you had invested that money at a 60-40.
Yes.
And that's what that was something they could have done and gotten that return. And then you say, well, they wouldn't have done that. Deviating from that says, that means I'm even better off doing something other than that 60-40. the value of doing something else is even greater. And it's not a surprise if you are on the edge of survival that you would deviate, that you would want to consume something. And that says the return to that dollar that you spend in consumption to survive is greater than even the 60-40 mix.
That statement, is that rooted in economic theory? Like, are there papers about that?
Well, I don't know if there are papers. The questions that are being posed here have not exactly been posed that often. I mean, in precisely that way. But the notion that for a rational individual, you give them an opportunity and you see that they deviated from that, that means that the thing that they chose was more valuable than the first thing that you gave them.
Okay.
So that means that 60-40 mix was an underestimate of the value of what they could have gotten. And so to put it another way, where there's is a literature, we talk about the money metric. How do you convert a stream of returns into today monetary value, where you're trying to talk about the value of consumption and lots of other things and convert it all into a money metric. What that says is the money metric of what the deprivation of not getting that money when they should have is greater than the number that I calculated using the 60-40.
Thank you.
Can I just ask if I got one thing right? This is a couple of propositions ago. I think he said if a person is on the edge of survival, then the money they spend on consumption, or the, I don't know if it's called consumption or the investment in consumer goods or food, has a higher rate of return than a 60-40 portfolio.
Well, I mean, it's
Is
almost
that-
trivial. If you die, nothing else is relevant. So,
Right.
so, you know, money isn't everything in life. And before you can start enjoying money, you have to be able to be there to enjoy it. And that, I was putting it in an extreme, but we know that if you don't get adequate nutrition, you're not going to be able to benefit from anything else. And that will have an adverse effect on your health and so forth.
And well, we already know from your prior evidence that return on health is 14 or 15%, which is higher than the 7.2% 60-40.
Yeah, he doesn't include health expenditures in consumption. When what I'm saying here is nutrition is part of health, but it's not categorized as health, it's categorized as consumption. And so what I'm saying, those, I'll call it investments, because when you're at that extreme, it is an investment. It's, if you don't get it, you don't survive. And if you don't get adequate nutrition, we know that you won't survive as long. So they are as at that extreme are as important as health.
Thank you.
I wonder then if we could sort of, to summarize all of what you've been talking about these rates of return, turn to page 56 of 80 of your reply report. And there's a bar graph here. And I guess maybe if you could just explain, you've taken us through each of the, business, infrastructure, health, and education. And you by this chart, you're trying to demonstrate some comparisons. And perhaps we can just, the ones I wanted to focus on were the last two, the yellow and the orange. But can you explain what this bar graph means?
Okay, so this looks at the values of the compensations that we're talking about, and what we're trying to do is beginning on the left hand with one of their models, and their model 4. They have several models, but one of the things they try to do is to say they're all basically the same, doesn't make it, and we picked one, just, you know, and the other ones would have been a little bit different, a little bit lower, but those differences are small because they want
When you say the other ones, you're referring to Booth and Kersner's other models.
models 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then remember I went through and talked about corrections for a number of different things. And this just does it graphically. So the light blue correction adds to the consumption, rather than treating consumption at a 0 rate of return, adds to that a 0 real rate of return, adds the bond rate.
Okay, and these bars, that's assuming the proportions that Booth and Kersner use.
That's right, not the changes that might have occurred if they had gotten enough money.
Right.
Okay,
Okay.
so then we add to that. Remember, we said they double counted the depreciation. So you add to the blue the depreciation adjustment. And then
And you get the green.
you get the green. And then you add to that the return on human capital, which human capital, just a fancy word for education and health.
Okay.
Okay. And then you get the yellow.
Sorry, what happened to infrastructure?
You should have added, we will get even higher infrastructure. We also didn't add on business.
Oh,
Okay,
Okay.
so that it would be still higher.
so
Okay,
the yellow bar would be higher because of business and infrastructure if you were to adjust for that based on the comments you made.
exactly, based on the comics, what I talked about before. And the real point of the graph is to make it's a simple point, that when you make those corrections, you actually get a higher number than we get with our 60/40. And that's not a surprise. You say that, to me, that's not a surprise. Why? Because 60/40, remember, was what we viewed as a conservative estimate of what they could have done with the money if they invested it 40% in a bond fund and 60% in stocks, equity. And what we said is that's conservative. And why, I think I mentioned on Friday, why is it conservative? Because if you really had the money, you know that there are higher returns on infrastructure, on health and education than just putting it in the stock market, let alone putting in a mix of stocks and bonds. So once you start correctly saying, okay, let's expand the set of investments to include other things, real investments, then you get a higher number. And let me say, those are based, these calculations are on the experience, the average in the infrastructure, health, education. And my remark I made before was that because of diminishing returns, you would expect those returns in an impoverished people to be even higher.
Thank you, Professor. I wanted to turn now to some discussion about disparities in outcomes. Now, you've told us on Friday how you calculated that, but I have some more questions about that, and really framed around how I understood some of the other experts thought you had made errors, but I wanted to address that. You used an income gap approach. And as I understand it, and that one of the criticisms was that you should have used net worth. Have I got that right?
Yeah, the way, it was partly our fault. The way we put it in our report was estimating wealth disparities. And when a lot of people think of wealth, they think of financial wealth, and financial wealth, they think of net worth. But my understanding what the court was interested in is not just a wealth in a narrow monetary sense, but a broader sense. They actually said wealth and needs. So it was a really well-being, welfare, a well-being kind of analysis. And when you talk about wealth, it's not just financial wealth. It's, again, to use that word, human capital. It includes the total wealth, not only the financial wealth, but the other things that go into well-being. And so what we did is to say a good proxy, not a good, a conservative proxy for differences in wealth is income. We know that in standard metrics, income differences are much smaller than wealth differences. So by using income, the best we could measure it, we had a conservative estimate of the wealth disparities.
When you say good and the best we could measure it, is that a measure of reliability, or is reliability something different?
No, best, what I really meant is, nobody was collecting data back in 1850 in the form that we would have wanted to have that data. And so best in terms of the data sources that were available. I also think that, I said it conservative because we know that health disparities tend to be greater than income disparities, education disparities greater. So when we said we were doing a conservative way of conservative lens for seeing the magnitudes of the disparities, income was giving you, as they went year by year, that focusing on income would enable you to get a sense of the disparity, but a conservative sense of the disparity.
I think more to the point that you've given us an analysis, but based on your expertise, and I think maybe this is something the court needs to hear from, is it something that your figures, your numbers, is it something the court can rely on in making its decisions in this case when it comes to the disparity?
Yeah, those numbers are reliable in the sense that no matter what anybody did, they would say the disparities are very large, and at least as large as the magnitudes that we've estimated. So there is, in my mind, no doubt that there were huge disparities. And so the main point that I was using those deprivation numbers for was to say a agreement with even some element of kinship going beyond a commercial agreement, some element where you wanted to take into account relative deprivations, would say you ought to adjust the share of the Anishinaabe up.
Up from what?
Up from the number that comes up from the simply commercial perspective. So remember on Friday, we talked about what a commercial, just
Yes.
ordinary economic relationship. We talked about two frameworks, the bargaining model and the joint venture model, we call it. And then we said, okay, we want to go beyond that, to think about this as an ongoing relationship with reciprocity and renewal and kingship, that would mean that you would want to increase, and I would say probably significantly, the amount that would otherwise go on to Donna Shabak in a simply commercial relationship.
The next kind of criticism that I've read in the other reports was when you did your calculation on the income gap approach, you used a statistical mean instead, and Bodway and Smart say you should have used a median. I think that, am I correct in
That's
that?
right.
First thing I need you to do is explain the difference between mean and median.
Okay, so mean is just the same word as an average. Okay, so it's the differences in the average income as they are estimated. Okay, median is you look at the probability at the income distribution, and you say 50% have a higher income, 50% have a lower income. And so if you had a perfectly symmetric income distribution, the mean and the median would be the same. If you have a skewed income distribution with a few people with a lot of wealth at the top, then mean will be greater than median. And so in the United States, we have a few very, very wealthy people. So and we've been getting more inequality at the very top. So the mean has been increasing much more than the median has been increasing.
I mean, I just, in your calculation, do you take account of people who don't earn anything? Or I mean, is that,
Well, the average,
whether
Yeah.
it's the mean or the median, the data, is it about people who work? Is it about the data of people who work, or is it about every human alive?
I think the data that we actually use, but you'll have to check with Mr. Hutchings on the exact data. I'm pretty
Okay.
sure the data is only the people who are working, but you'll have to
Okay.
check that.
Okay. So which is a bet in this particular, sorry, for your analysis dealing with the cohort, the Anishinaabe in this case, which is better, median or mean? And is this a proper complaint, and where does it all lead us to?
Well, the differences are so large that whether you focus on a metric based on median or mean, there are huge deprivations. So the qualitative analysis, which is where I was focusing on, should you adjust them significantly upward, would be unchanged whether you used the payments to the Anishinaabe upwards would be unaffected whether you use mean or median. That's sort of like a fine point on measurement, which economists get into. They love that kind of discussion about what is the right way. But in the end, in this case, if the differences were very small, then this would be an interesting discussion.
When you
But-
say if the differences are small, you mean the differences between the First Anishinaabe and non-Anishinaabe? You're not talking about the difference between mean
Yeah.
and median?
If the difference between the Anishinaabe and the rest of Ontario were very small, then we might quibble about which is the right metric. But the differences are huge. And therefore, I don't think anybody would say whatever metric you use reasonably, that there is not significant deprivation, which should be adjusted in the way that I suggested. Now, which is the more relevant one? If I had to make a choice, we talk about that in our report. And anybody particularly concerned about the deprivations of the people at the very bottom, including, you know, the people who don't have an employment, would say that the median doesn't capture some of the things that you're really interested in. You really want to know the number of people who are in these extremes of deprivation. And if you want to talk about economic opportunity, you want to also focus a little bit on what are the opportunities at the top. So in a way, the median doesn't capture either of those two.
So you can defend, and you do defend, the use of mean.
That's right. But we need to, you know, I think in the overall, you need to look at the other parts of the distribution, but the mean is probably for this purpose, a better metric than median, but it doesn't, for the qualitative purpose that I was using it.
Yeah.
Doesn't, this is a refinement that when it doesn't need to bother oneself too much.
Now, I know Bodway and Smart did not, although they say you should have used median, they don't do a calculation at all. I couldn't find it anyway.
No, that's why we don't, you know, they don't do, they're raising a theoretical point, which people would in the literature, if they're trying to, you know, getting an article published in the journal, that's the kind of thing referees would discuss and say, have you gotten it right? And, but it's not, you know, to me, this is and one of those, given all the big issues that we have to discuss, this is really a small bore point.
So I don't know if you can answer this, or if you've turned your mind to it, but we know from your reports that the range is depending on what populations you use between for deprivation, 153 billion to 193 billion. How does that dramatically change if you use the median?
I haven't looked at those numbers. And let me say one more thing.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that we, and I think most other economists would use mean, and one of the, is that data for median are much harder to get. You know, this goes back to the first point I made on Friday, that getting 170 years of data is a jargon to it, is a big task. And to do the median, you have to have the whole income distribution. And we're having enough trouble just getting the average, you know, the income and the average income, total income. And to get the whole income distribution is really, really hard. And the way we do it today is we do surveys, and there are a lot of questions about the surveys. There's a lot of controversy about the surveys. People at the bottom often don't answer. People at the top don't answer. So there are real questions about the reliability of median data. And the general sense is that mean data is more reliable than median data, but it just simply wasn't available. And if we want to track what was going on over 170 years, you really had no choice. And that, I suspect, was why Professors Bodway and Smart didn't do the alternative estimate that they said should have been done.
Okay. A third kind of complaint about the income gap approach is that you did not confine yourself to people existing or currently alive. The cohort of First Nations members that are currently alive, and can you maybe comment on whether that's a complaint that's got some teeth to it?
Yeah.
Just checking that's a Bodway and Smart criticism.
Yeah, I think it's Bodway and Smart criticism on
Thank
that.
you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the way I thought of it is we want an idea of what should have been given to the First Nation each year. 1850, 1851, 1852, 1853. Those are just the numbers that we want to calculate. What should have been part of the augmentation clause, the implementation of the treaty. And in each year, what we're saying is, okay, we've defined what the outcomes would have been in a commercial, but we're just a commercial. So let's say in 1850, they should have given, or say 1860 should have given $30,000, whatever that number is.
Let's just use 30. It's just a hypothetical.
Hypothetical.
Right.
And this deprivation analysis says they should have actually given more because they would want to reduce the disparity. And I haven't defined precisely how much more. That's really, I would say, a matter for the court. But let's say there was a framework that said, well, you ought to be moving towards equalizing education and health opportunities, and it's going to take another $5,000 or $10,000. So then you would put in the ledger what is owed in 1860 is not 30,000, but 40,000. That adjustment is based on the people in 1860. You know, we're trying to put our minds back into what was the intention of the treaty. And the intention was my understanding of it is of a sharing relationship, and a sharing relationship of where some notion of kingship of trying to bring the two closer together. And that would mean you would add on, given the magnitude of the deprivations, you would want to add on something. As I say,
Right.
exactly how much I can't tell you. But that would say if you decide it was $10,000, then that goes on the ledger. 40,000 should have been paid in 1860. And you do that for 1861, 1862. And then you look at that whole ledger, you use a spreadsheet, and then you say, okay, this is what should have been paid each of those years. And let's add it up. And yet those numbers are what they are.
And for those that would look at only the current population, is there something about intergenerational, the time it takes to correct in disparities that matters here?
Well, I mean, what is true, I think, is that if you don't compensate, if you don't reduce those disparities early on, they build on themselves. They call it a poverty trap.
Like compounding interest.
But it's the opposite side. That poverty one year, second year is worse, third year is worse. And undoing, let me put it like this, undoing 170 years of poverty may take a lot of money. That, you know,
Over what period of time?
it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, that you know, I can't tell you how long it's going to take to undo that long period of deprivation.
But you
And-
can say it's not a one-time fix.
It's not a one-time fix. It's going to take a long time. And I don't, you know, and I think, and it's going to take a lot of money. Those are the two things I'm going to say. It's going to take a long time and a lot of money.
Maybe then, Professor, we can turn to slide 80, which is your summary of results. And we're right near the end of my questions. And I wonder if you can just summarize for us, which I think you do in slides 80 and 81, the results of your work in trying to assist the court in figuring out what an appropriate measure of compensation is.
Yeah, well, this is only summary of part of what we've talked about on Friday and this morning. Because if you remember, I talked about there being a series of big issues like the apportionment of cost to various categories, the treatment of risk, the problem of NCRRs not capturing as well as they could the rents, the indirect rents, the indirect crown resource revenues from other forms of taxes. So what I wanted to do here is one of the things when I began on Friday, I talked about there being a few big factors that really drove the results. And this illustrates one of those big factors, and that is the discount rate. And the discount rate is how you bring, as I said before, past numbers up front. So we take the rents that we calculate, and let me clear, in calculating that, we don't accept the Bodway Smart risk adjustment, bringing everything back to 1850. We think that's wrong on several accounts that I explained. We don't allocate all the forestry expenses to rents. We think that's a misallocation, and there are several other detailed ones that Mr. Hutchings will go through. So it's based on our estimate of what are the appropriate expenses that ought to be attributed to rents. But using then our definition of rents, what you see if you just take the nominal value of those rents, add them up from 1850 to 2019, they come out to 3,586,000,000. And of that, forgetting about rounding, the amount actually paid was 1. So if you just
That's in millions of dollars. This is all in.
you want 1 million, yeah. So that gives you a flavor of, without doing anything fancy, of all the value of the land as we estimated, land and resources, without adjusting for discounting or anything else. Basically, they got almost nothing. Okay. They being Donna Shopik. And then we do just to what we said is economists like to think of everything in real terms. So adjusting it for inflation, the numbers turn out to be about 8 billion in rents, and the amount paid is 12 million, still minuscule. Then we use what Bodway and Smart say is their preferred discount rate, which is the long-term bond rate, which is around 5% nominal, around 2.5% real. And that turns out to be just short of 28 billion. And the Anishapik got 201 million. So they got somewhat under 1%. Then we have another column where we use the band trust account. But let me go on to
Just before it says Hutchings in brackets there. Now, Mr. Hutchings did the calculation, but you and Mr. Hutchings do not advocate for the band trust account rate.
no, we advocate for the final column, which is the 60-40, which is conservative relative to what the pension funds are doing, the Canadian pension funds are doing, and so forth. And this is, you might say, the power of compound interest, and you get $126 billion, of which the First Nation got under $4 billion. So what we're saying, roughly, depending on which rate, they're getting numbers that are under 3% of the value of what was of the value of the resources, as we estimate. Now, remember, I mean, I just say, they don't think the value there was any they think RST was a loss.
This is Ontario.
Yeah, Ontario, their argument was a big wash, should never a bad deal, because it's just a loss, sink, because they had all these logging expenses. They just keep all those negatives we talked about this morning, those losses. So these are our estimates, not of regs, not their estimates. So I want to make that clear. But I think they're wrong, because the reason they got those negatives, those losses, are because they're misallocating, misattributing all those expenses disproportionately to the Crown, to the net Crown resource ranks.
And we'll speak to Mr. Hutchings about, because he did some calculations about net Crown resource revenues, and that comes out to a very different number. And just to alert the court to it, it comes out to, I think, about 58 billion at the 60-40, and that's part of evidence you'll hear from Mr. Hutchings.
Thank you.
So you wanted to perhaps contextualize your results on
Well,
value.
Obviously, when you see numbers like that, it's so sort of, there's a sticker shock. They're big numbers, and I want to put those in perspective. And they're just three things I want to emphasize. First, accumulating and compounding significant deficiencies over 170 years is going to inevitably wind up with big numbers. You take small numbers and multiply them by 170, and then you compound them at any reasonable interest rate, you're going to wind up with a big number. So that is what you have to accept. If you've owed somebody something year after year after year for 170 years, it's a lot of money. So you shouldn't feel, you just have to understand that's the consequence of that kind of not paying what one ought to have paid. And one has to see the number in that perspective, okay, of 170 years. The second point is the one that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, which is deprivations of the magnitude and the persistence that we've noted will take a long time and large expenditures to undo. And I can't tell you how much, and I can't tell you how long, but I can assure you that it will be a lot and a long time. And the third thing is our numbers, I think, unequivocally show that there was actually a tremendous amount of value generated by the lands and the resources of the RST. And I think the numbers I just showed that the Anishinaabe did not appropriately share in that value. They got a minuscule fraction of that value.
Professor Stiglitz, the court may have a couple questions for you. I know Mr. Gover has a couple for you, but I've run out of questions.
Very good.
And thank you for your time and energy in helping.
Nothing from me at this time. Thank you.
And good afternoon, Professor Stiglitz.
Good afternoon.
As you've just heard, my name is Brian Gover. I act for a group of 7 added party plaintiff First Nations. I only have 2 areas to discuss with you. And the first takes us back to this concept of economic rent. And in slide 65 of Exhibit 5, you set out key areas of disagreement with Canada's and Ontario's experts. And you referred to the relevance of the economic rent model. My question is this: is there any economic model other than economic rent that fully captures the value of land and resources?
Well, let me say, the idea that rent is the way you think about capturing the value is, I would say, the theory. I mean, I think that's what, going back a very long time, is what is the accepted way of thinking about the value of a land and resources. My only hesitation is that there are, in the way we approached it, we focused only on the economic value. And what we said, remember in the beginning of my exposition on Friday, that there were non-economic values as well. And by non-economic, I mean both the values that might be viewed from the perspective of the First Nation, or values that might be perceived from the perspective of the world today. I mentioned the value of carbon sequestration that comes from the storage of carbon in the forest. We didn't include that in our rent calculation, but in terms of economic value, yes, it is the way that the rents are the way of looking at the economic value.
Thank you, Professor. And secondly, you discussed Crown land to some extent on Friday. And to clarify, if the Crown decided to do nothing with a portion of the Robinson Superior Treaty territory, it did not sell it or give it away, it did not license any mining or forestry on it, it did not license any hydroelectric operations on it, it just let it stay dormant. How would the value of that land be captured in your calculations of economic rent, if at all?
It would not be captured. In our approach, we're only looking at economic rents. And remember how we talked about economic rents? It was the value, the gross revenues minus the value of the resources that were needed to realize those gross revenues. So in your hypothetical, or maybe not hypothetical, your example, those parts of the RST that were just left didn't yield any gross revenue. And so they're just not there, even though there's a value. So that really links to the first question you asked. There's value there, but it's not captured in our measure of value, which is just focusing on economic value.
So there's value to the land, and it may have spiritual value, it may have value that can be realized in the future. Is that right?
That's right. But in terms of our calculation, the number that I showed in the last slide, that's not captured there at all.
And how does the approach you just described relate, if at all, to the conservativeness, if I can call it that, of your approach?
Yeah, it illustrates, it's another example of the fact that our approach is conservative. We haven't really captured the full value of the land.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
There's point here that there's-
So
You want me to-
you just said that it would not be captured in our approach. We only talked about economic rents. And that is the gross revenues minus the value of the resources that were needed to realize those gross revenues.
Yes,
Have I got that correctly?
Is it gross revenues minus the value of the resources or minus?
no, minus the cost of the inputs
Right.
that are necessary to realize those gross revenues.
Okay.
Thank you for correcting.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it just came up and I thought, couldn't.
Okay, I'm just going to, I made a note of one question. I'm just going to see if I can find it. And then I'll see if I'm even going to ask it. So I'm only a recent student of economics. And it seems to me that the economic model, whether yours or the other economists, are based on a set of assumptions. And one of the assumptions which you averted to today is a capitalist society with a certain kind of market and rational beings, rational, presumably being rational capitalists. Do I have that right? Like want to realize on investment. So my question, if I can find it, is it seems to me that at every stage of your analysis, you have to correct for the fact that there was no open competitive market. Firstly, because of the proclamation of 1763 that where the crown said only transfers of land could only be made to the crown. But secondly, perhaps because it was a nascent and developing colony and economy. So I presume I have that right, that those are, you have to correct all along the way. Everybody does for those. Are there, I'm so worried about asking this question, but are there no models of, are there no economic models that are already in use or have been developed that would take into account a developing economy where, for instance, in your example of they would have chosen, in a competitive search, they would have chosen a better manager, perhaps, or they would have had the opportunity to choose a better manager. Well, what if there was no better manager to be found because of how small the market was, how small the colony was, the population, the entire market?
So that was why I began, that was why one of the two models that we presented was the bargaining model. That model was explicitly presented because I worried about exactly the question that you posed. That model says there was no other supplier of managerial services, to put it that way, okay? They had to rely, the Anashobik had to rely on the crown, and the crown wanted to do a deal with the Anashobik, and they were wedded together. Okay, and the analysis that we presented was the standard analysis of what would have come out of that kind of deal, that kind of a world. And that is that they would get 50% of the surplus, which in our calculations turns out to be 58% of the total ranks that would have been generated. Okay, so that really was explicitly directed at that question. And then my own feeling is that the appropriate answer to the question going forward 170 years was there were nascent entrepreneurs. There were people who were, some of them south of the border that would have come in had the Crown said you could. It wasn't there, it wasn't a well-developed market, but if you said, could there have been a market? Let's not use force to say you can't, try to make this a agreement, a really voluntary agreement. Okay, so we're going to put aside for a moment, and that this is a legal issue on your part, but let's put aside that, I'm looking at this as an economist, put aside that restraint. We're doing this as voluntary parties getting together. My view is there would have been competition, not perfect, not perfect competition, but there would have been competition for managerial services, logging, certain kinds of mines, gold mines. We'd had a lot of,
I think I have it. So going back to that initial thing there, so you looked at the bargaining framework, you rejected one framework and went to the bargaining framework. And now the follow-up question on that is, I think that what you're doing in that analysis is presuming equality of bargaining power. Am I wrong about that?
Yes and no. So the way the standard bargaining model works is, in that example, is there are two parties, they have to reach an agreement. Each has the veto power. So in that world, each has equal power. That's the assumption. They each have to give their assent. And there's a recent book by a professor at Yale, Barry Nailbuff, who is called Sharing the Pie. And he explains this as the basic idea of how you divide the pie. But it begins, as you say, with each of the two believing that they really have the veto power. Now, if one of them doesn't really believe they have the veto power, then that's not a really fair bargain. And of course, you're going to get outcomes that are different from that. But this is what the outcome would be if you really said each of you have to agree at the outcome. It would be a 50-50 share of the surplus. And then, as I say, what my view was that to the extent that you think there was competition, you go from that 58 closer to the 84%. If you had perfect competition, it'd be 84%. If you had a large supply, set of suppliers of managerial services, it would have been 84%. If you had none, the Crown is the only supplier, it's 58, and somewhere, the real world is obvious, it's not perfect competition, but it's somewhere between the two. But also remember what I said is, I didn't think 84 was the appropriate risk sharing number, because I didn't think that the Crown absorbed much risk. because that $2,000, it was clear that the resource, almost for certain that the resources were worth that. And it turned out that was right. So it's somewhere between 58 and something like 100. And then just the final qualification is it's 100. I mean, these are measured resources. And we've had a lot of discussion about how those measured resources are not really the total economic value of the resources, because we had all kinds of measurement problems. So we didn't measure the total economic value, let alone the total value of the resources.
May I ask?
I was just going to invite you to ask any follow-up questions if I've.
Just to be clear, I think you said this on Friday, the 58% is self-interested individuals, not involving or considering the interests of the person they're bargaining with.
That's right. And so there's no kingship there, and doesn't have any of the kinds of things that we were talking about earlier this afternoon.
And my second point is actually not a question, but just an observation about the pie and dividing the pie. And I just realized that my mother had it right all along. And what she used to do when there were two kids who wanted to share a piece of pie, she gave one of them the knife and said, "You first, child. You're the first one. You divide up you make the slice." And the other child, the second child, got to choose which slice of the pie to take. And it seems to me that my mom was right all along.
So easy with two kids. Sorry to steal that from you. There are no other questions on this side arising from mine.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. Thank you very much. I think this was a longer day than you anticipated, and we all appreciate your time here. Thank you so much. All right.
10 o'clock tomorrow for cross-examination.
So could we just have a bit of a time estimates here going forward? I didn't realize when you stood up to address this on Friday, Mr. Marcello, that Friday had originally been scheduled for cross-examinations, which tells me that there was some anticipation that, no, I'm seeing a head shake. I'm only looking at what I've been given. That's where I get all my information. So if it should be corrected, I'm super happy for that to happen. So, so I was presuming that the parties at the time that this was drafted, the way I now read it,
As I'm being addressed.
the way I read it, I presumed that was a pre-estimate by the parties, that was the time they needed. They needed half a day or some portion of Monday, Tuesday, and possibly Wednesday. So now would you tell me what you actually expect?
I think if I spill past the lunch break, it won't be by more than an hour. And I understand my friend from Canada has quite a short cross-examination.
Okay, so just tell me what you think in timing. Are you talking?
Well, tomorrow we're
Two-
done.
No,
We'll finish.
spill past the lunch break. Today there was some suggestion we might take lunch at 2. What are you talking about?
If I'm
Turns
betting
out-
on it, I bet that I finish, if we start at 10 and we go till 1-ish, I think the over under is I finish before lunch,
Okay,
but I don't have like a high degree of confidence in that. So that's where I'm putting my money, but
not that much money.
not that much money. Not that much.
I do have a colleague who said, take what they say at 50%.
Nah, better than that, better than that. I think we'll, I think, I mean, it also depends on you know, my friend had a straight line. We'll see how smooth it all goes. As long
Alright.
as that,
So you say you're less than a day, somewhere between half a day and,
somewhere between
3/4 a
half a
day.
day and a day, I think, but hopefully we finish it all tomorrow.
okay,
Yes,
well,
Professor.
I'll hear from Canada.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sevens,
And Your Honor, you just want to know how much time I intend to take in cross-examination?
how much, your best estimate?
45 minutes.
Okay. And what is your plan then? So in your, and in looking at this schedule, your plan then would be that Wednesday, Thursday and Friday would be not sitting?
Well, on the current schedule, then I'm sorry if Your Honor doesn't have the right one, but it was supposed to be Chief and Cross today,
Yes,
but we don't have time for Cross, maybe move that to Tuesday's Cross. Wednesday is finishing up Cross and redirect. And what I think my friend, Mr. Marcel and I are saying is we should be able to finish the entire Cross tomorrow. So Wednesday could be used for practice redirect. Or, potentially finish the whole thing tomorrow. Take Wednesday.
Perhaps I'll have no questions.
Right.
I don't know.
right. So if the two crosses and the redirect are finished, the plan still is that those days are non-sitting. There are no witnesses to be called on those days.
That's correct.
Okay, so just let me tell you that when I put my mind to reading this schedule on the weekend for the first time, I noticed that there is a witness scheduled for the week of the 13th. And the week of the 13th in the original schedule was not scheduled for witnesses. And when I received the schedule, I didn't look at it carefully, but I said, and is there still a March break in there? And the answer was yes. So I assumed it was the same one. Anyway, I have a problem with the first 2 days of that week. So I'll just 13, 14. Yeah. So I'll just leave that with you, okay? Because in the original schedule, it wasn't scheduled. All right, thanks. Okay. Is there anything else we can possibly do today? All right, thank you again, sir. We break now till tomorrow at 10.
Oyez, oyez, oyez. The sittings of this court are now concluded. Long live the king. Thank you.